vaudeville was a very interesting thing, and in some ways, I think that it's come the full circle when you turn on the television now and you see America's Got Talent and all these different shows that really are another version of vaudeville, and vaudeville was really attracted the masses. I mean, there were opera houses. Willie Hammerstein, who had his vaudeville house, his father, who was the first Oscar Hammerstein, loved opera, and he built these houses, and he was losing money head over heels because how many people really want to go see opera? And so vaudeville was more for the mainstream people, and you went to the theater for a couple hours, and you would see a whole bunch of different acts. I mean, Donlin and Mabel, their initial act was almost 20 minutes. That was long, and maybe the next person on the that would come on the stage had a couple dancing dogs.
That was Steve Steinberg, co-author of Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life, from New York Baseball Idol to Stage and Screen, from an episode of the Irish Baseball Podcast that aired back in January. Hello and welcome to episode 112 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. I'll be wrapping up my 3-episode-long conversation with Steve Steinberg on the show today. We will not only talk more about Mike Donlin, but we will also hear about some of his other baseball books. We're already almost a third of the way through 2025, and we are about 1 month into the Major League Baseball season. On the podcast, we've heard about Civil War heroes and athletes who have had their legacies lost to time. We've learned more about European baseball and the steps necessary for Ireland to eventually compete in the World Baseball Classic. With all that in mind, there is so much more on the horizon with the Irish American Baseball Society. We're going to have more Irish Wolfhounds games scattered throughout the country. There will be more information regarding the Irish American Baseball Hall of Fame. I'll be talking to authors, hikers, players, and museum employees. Everybody we have on the show is dedicated to spreading the love of baseball or Irish heritage. Make sure you are a member of the Irish American Baseball Society and make sure that you're following along to our social media pages. You won't want to miss what is coming up over the next few months. Let's get back to our conversation with Steve Steinberg. We left things off talking about Donlin's film career, including a movie where he played himself. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for the opportunity to share the story about this great ball player, remarkable story, the guy who has been virtually forgotten.
So his first film being a story about his life, the fact that he had already sort of been that famous, I think that really does put it into perspective just how much of a celebrity he was at the time, because they're not talking about making movies of him now. I mean, maybe now with your book they will start talking about making a movie of him, but that's pretty incredible that he was that famous.
Yeah, it was the first feature film, I think, of a ball player, and as many of those feature films where it was cleaned up a little bit, I don't think his drinking was not, and that film has not survived. His drinking was not in there, but it was a typical case of a ball player, played minor league ball, who wanted to marry the young girl whose father said he's a ball player, so you can't marry him, until Donlin rescues them when their chariot is being, run over, the horses are running away. And interestingly enough, even though the movie was 1915, 4 years before the Black Sox scandal, in the plot of the movie, he is kidnapped by gamblers and has to get away and escape with the help of his wife. His real wife was in the movie but did not play his wife, and he arrives at the ballpark just in time to win the game, and after that gain the hand of the woman that he loved. And there's a scout for the New York Giants in the movie who signs him at the end of the game, and John McGraw plays the scout. So McGraw agreed to appear in that Donlin movie. But interesting, because gambling sort of broke into the open in 1919 World Series. In 1920, it didn't come out till 20. And here's a movie a few years later that has a plot in which the gamblers are trying to affect the outcome of the game. But Mike Donlin is above all that and refuses the bribe and escapes from the clutches of the gamblers to save the day, save the game.
Well, I know that with the 1919 Black Sox, that's when people really started talking about it in the open, about the influence of gambling. But there were rumors that World Series had been fixed well before that. There were rumors about the 1918 World Series that had some shenanigans going on with it as well. So it's interesting to see that gamblers trying to impact the game was a common enough thought that it would appear in this movie that he made 4 years before the Black Sox scandal. It just goes to show that it wasn't as big of a surprise as maybe the 8 Men Out movie makes it seem. The gamblers might get involved in the World Series.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think more fans might be aware now of the 1908, let's say 1918 possibilities of corruption than in 1918 itself, because the sports writers were very much in bed with they wanted to protect the game and protect the idols because these guys are selling newspapers. New York City had in 1919, I think 13 daily newspapers. Then they started consolidating and doing some mergers. So it was very rare. And even when Hugh Fullerton tried to expose the Black Sox scandal, I mean, he just was attacked from virtually every other sports writer as being, just going down the wrong path. He's got a paranoid mind, et cetera, et cetera. So, but you're right. It was certainly conceivable, and it was in that movie.
So you mentioned your other book, or another book that you wrote about Urban Shocker, famous for being a part of the 1927 Yankees. Well, should be famous for being a part of the 27 Yankees, but maybe is overlooked. So as you pick out these two baseball players, Urban Shocker and now Donlin, what made you specifically look at these two guys? And I guess we've talked about Donlin a lot at this point, but what was it about Shocker that made you decide this guy needs his story told to a new generation?
Well, here again, I really just get turned on and bringing people back to life. And it even has a little bit, without sounding too maudlin, a little bit of a spiritual aspect to it, because you're uncovering, recovering, rediscovering these people. And in the case of Shocker, I mean, this is a great pitcher, went 18-6 on the 27 Yankees, and maybe I'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about him in the next 3 years because the 100th anniversary is coming up of that team. But Shocker was dying of heart disease at the time, so it even layers another element on the story. And he was dead before the 1928 World Series of mitral valve failure. So what turns on the juices for me, and I think for Lyle also, is to find and tell the story of somebody who's been forgotten. Even though, again, like I said, in the 1920s, I think the overwhelming majority of 10-year-old kids in America knew who Urban Shocker was. In 1908, the majority of the kids in America knew who Donlin was. Donlin, of course, was really had more of a bad boy image. And a lot of times, kids and teenagers may like that bad boy image. And the fact remains, Donlin got extra chances because he was so good. If he had been a marginal ball player, we even see that nowadays with ball players. If he's a superstar, even if he's a quote unquote scoundrel, but he's our scoundrel, as sometimes the phrase is. So Donlin did get those extra chances, and these are guys that just have remarkable stories that deserve to be remembered and deserve to be told, and everything that they overcame, and that really just gets the juices flowing in the research and the writing.
And you mentioned, and you wanted to make sure we didn't skip your co-author, Lyle Spatz. He has written a number of baseball books as well. What was it like kind of bringing your two research capabilities together and putting together this book? Because he definitely is no stranger to writing about baseball players from a begotten era, and you had that one experience with it. How did you find that your collaboration really brought out the best in both of you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because usually when I'm interviewed, that we're not talking about the writing process. But I mean, Lyle and I mean, he lives down in Florida, and I live in Seattle. But of course, you exchange files. It really is a true collaboration because sometimes you can say two guys write a book, and one guy says, "Well, I'll take this era or these chapters, you take that chapters," because somebody's got to write the first draft, but then we go back and forth with editing and maybe 5 or 6 rounds of editing, and then we send the books out to some of our colleagues for critiques, and then we come back and we do another round of back and forth and in taking their input, and then finally we give it to our fact checker. And I think it's like any relationship, it's probably a little bit more complicated than just sitting down and writing a book on your own. But what you have in the final end product, I think is all that much better. And I think we complement each other in different ways. I think Lyle has a real strength as a wordsmith and really polishing the writing up, and really a lot of precision in his style. I may tend to fill in the blanks a little bit more. Whenever you tell a story, you have these gaps in history, no matter how much research you're going to do. And then the question comes up, well, how many liberties do you take in the gaps? And we always had an unwritten rule that if we really disagreed on something, and it could happen, that we would it would defer to the guy that wrote the first draft of the book. And in the first book that Lyle and I ever wrote, which together was 1921, the first year that the Yankees won the pennant. And in really the penultimate game of the series against the Cleveland Indians, a sports writer wrote in his column that there were two boys sitting behind third base, and he overheard them saying, "Gosh, if only we could be in Times Square right now." Now, in Times Square, you would see one of those big electronic boards, and thousands of people would stand there. And it's very interesting because Lyle was sort of challenging that, because how could it be that two kids who are sitting behind third base would rather be at Times Square, where their imagination could come wild? And I actually ended up meeting the Eric Rolf Greenberg, who wrote the classic Christy Mathewson novel about the Giants called The Celebrant, considered the greatest baseball novel ever written. And his eyes sparkled and twinkled, the Greenberg, because he could relate to that. And it it's like when you listen on the radio instead of TV, your mind can fill in all the things. So it's been a process, and continues to be a process. Lyle probably has more expertise earlier and he wrote the Willie Keeler biography, for example. I key in a little bit more on the 20s. So from that standpoint, it's been a great partnership, gone on for about 20 years.
I tell you what, Steve Steinberg, you wrote the book along with Lyle Spatz, Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life from New York Baseball Idol to Stage and Screen. Where can people pick up this book? How can they get it if they want to learn more about this great Irish American baseball player?
Well, they can get it anywhere that they get their books, certainly on Amazon. University of Nebraska Press is offering it also, and that's been our publisher of choice for our books. And we haven't had time to really talk much as Donlin gets back into the 1920s, and he becomes friends with two of the most famous actors in Hollywood who really love baseball also. And Buster Keaton is one of them, and Donlin appears in what is now considered one of the greatest films of all time, even though it was panned at the time, The General. And Keaton also was a heavy drinker back as early as the 20s. So there's an interesting Hollywood part of the story at the end, although Donlin still drifts back on stage. And Ed Sullivan, who some of us older folks may remember from his variety show, he had like a Gossip Society column in the 1930s. And when he saw Donlin on Broadway in the early 30s, he was just raving about his acting and did a feature column that we quote from. So Donlin did die probably of heart disease in the early 1930s. And that film clip that I mentioned was from a movie called One Way Passage with William Powell. And if you Google it, it's in the MGM archives, and you'll see it. And Mike Donlin, when he was about 50 years old, looked like he was about 70 years old. So he had a lot of wear on those tires, so to speak. And we've written a book about Miller Huggins, the manager of the Yankees. And he too, when he was 50 years old, he looked like he was 70. In his case, it was more less about drinking and more about dealing with Babe Ruth that aged him prematurely. But yeah, these guys they age quite quickly, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, that's gonna happen. I can't imagine being responsible for keeping the babe in line. That probably would certainly stress you out a little bit if you knew your job depended on this guy showing up to the park every day and he just didn't always do that.
Yeah.
But this book, I definitely think if you listen to our podcast, you're interested in Irish Americans in baseball. And this is somebody who was forgotten and has lived such an interesting life that you just during this interview make his life sort of spring off the page. And I can't imagine, for the entire book and how much you can learn. And I was trying to keep some things secret for the readers and
Okay.
you keep going, but that's fine. But I'm sure there are more stories through this.
Well, I'll leave you with one tidbit, and I'm not going to give you the punchline, but Donlin was the ultimate competitor. And many articles have said that the two most fiery guys in baseball in the dead ball era were Mike Donlin and Johnny Evers of the Cubs. And in 1908, the whole season came down to one game in the Polo Grounds in New York, and Donlin's Giants were beaten by the hated Cubs. And after the game, Donlin walked up to Hugh Fullerton, a very famous baseball writer, and said, "Hugh, I'm going to tell you something, and you can never repeat it. I am glad the Cubs won." Now, this is the most competitive guy. He hated the Cubs. And Hugh Fullerton sat on that story until 1922. And when he revealed the reason why, and I'm not going to give the punchline of that one, because he said it just revealed so much about the nature of this guy and the good-hearted and decent nature of this guy, even though he appeared, and his nickname was Turkey Mike, because he walked around with a turkey strut. And we have on the back of our book, we have a blurb from Damon Runyon, who was been dead 80 years before we wrote our book. We convinced our publisher to put him there because Damon Runyon, the great writer and playwright, said that this guy coming to the plate was far more colorful than Babe Ruth. He may not have hit as many home runs as Babe Ruth, but the electricity in the air when he walked to the plate, he had it over Babe Ruth.
Amazing. Yeah, I am so looking forward to actually sitting down with this book and getting the whole way through it, because I know there's so many great stories like that one. And it is, like I said, Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life, from New York baseball idol to stage and screen. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for letting Mike have his moment in the spotlight here.
That was Steve Steinberg, co-author of Mike Donlin, A Rough and Rowdy Life, from New York baseball idol to stage and screen. I'm your host, Rick Becker. We have new conversations every other Monday evening. This has been episode 112 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.